Section 11 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 3, Chapter 3. How the modification of the soul of races affects the historical evolution of peoples. The influence of foreign elements at once transforms the soul of a race and in consequence its civilization. Example of the Romans. Roman civilization was not destroyed by military invasions, but by the pacific invasions of the barbarians. The barbarians never formed the project of destroying the empire. Their invasions were not of the nature of conquests. The early Frank chiefs always considered themselves to be functionaries of the Roman Empire. They always respected Roman civilization, and their aim was to continue it. It was only from the 7th century onwards that the Gallic barbarian chiefs ceased to consider the emperor as their superior. The complete transformation of Roman civilization was not the consequence of a work of destruction, but of the adoption of an ancient civilization by a new race. The modern invasions of the United States, the civil strife and the breaking up of the United States into independent and rival states to which these invasions will lead, the invasion of France by foreigners and their consequences. The examples we have cited show that the history of a people does not depend on its institutions, but on its character, that is to say, on its race. We further saw, when studying the formation of historical races, that their dissolution is the result of crossbreeding, and that the peoples which have preserved their unity and force, the Aryans, for example, in India in the past, and in modern times the English in their various colonies, are those who have always carefully avoided intermarrying with foreigners. The presence in the midst of a people of foreigners, even in small numbers, is sufficient to affect its soul, since it causes it to lose its capacity for defending the characteristics of its race, the monuments of its history, and the achievements of its ancestors. This conclusion arises out of all of what precedes. If the various elements of a civilization are to be regarded as the exterior manifestation of the soul of a people, it is evident that as soon as the soul of the people changes, its civilization should change as well. The history of the past supplies us with incontrovertible proof that this is what indeed occurs, and the history of the future will furnish many other such proofs. The progressive transformation of Roman civilization is one of the most striking examples it is possible to invoke. Historians usually picture this event as the result of the destructive invasions of the barbarians, but a more attentive study of the facts shows, on the one hand, that it was pacific and not warlike invasions which brought about the fall of the empire, and on the other hand, that the barbarians, far from having wished to overthrow Roman civilization, devoted all their efforts towards adopting and continuing institutions of which they were the respectful admirers. They essayed to appropriate the language, the institutions, and the arts of Rome. Down to the time of the last of the Merovingians, they endeavoured to continue the great civilization of which they were the heirs. This guiding intention is reflected in all the acts of the great emperor Charlemagne. We know, however, that such a task has always been impossible. The barbarians needed several centuries before they could form, by repeated crosses and identical conditions of existence, a race in any way homogeneous, and when this race was formed, it possessed, merely in virtue of the fact of its creation, a new language and new institutions, and in consequence a new civilization. The mighty traditions of Rome left their impress deeply marked on this civilization, but the various efforts to revive the civilization of Rome itself have always been vain. The Renaissance endeavoured in vain to revive its arts, and the Revolution to bring back its institutions. The barbarians who successively invaded the empire from the 1st century onwards, and who in the end absorbed it, never proposed to destroy, but, on the contrary, to continue its civilization. Had they never waged war on Rome, had they confined themselves to mixing with the Romans in ever-increasing numbers, the course of history would not have been changed. They would not have destroyed the empire, but their mere mingling with the Roman people would have sufficed to destroy its soul. It may be said, then, that the Roman civilization has never been overthrown, but has simply been continued. transforming itself in the course of ages by the mere fact of its having fallen into the hands of different races. A glance at the history of the barbarian invasions is amply sufficient to justify what precedes. The labours of modern scholars, and particularly those of Fustel de Coulanges, have clearly shown that it was the pacific and not the aggressive invasions of the barbarians. The aggressive invasions were easily repulsed by barbarians in the pay of the empire. That brought about the progressive disappearance of the might of Rome. As early as the times of the first emperors, the custom had been introduced of employing barbarians in the army. It gained ground in proportion as the Romans became richer and more refractory to military service, till after the lapse of several centuries there were none but foreigners in the army as in the administration. The Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Franks were federate soldiers in the service of the Roman Empire. When Rome came to have none but barbarians in its service, and when its provinces were governed by barbarian chiefs, it was evident that these chiefs would render themselves progressively more and more independent. They were indeed successful in this effort, but such was the prestige of Rome that it never occurred to any of them to overthrow the empire, even when Rome fell into their power. When one of these chiefs, Odoacer, king of the Heruti, in the pay of the empire, possessed himself of Rome in 476, he hastened to ask the emperor, whose residence at this time was Constantinople, for his authorization to govern Italy with the title of patrician. None of the other chiefs behaved differently. It was always in the name of Rome that they governed their provinces. It never occurred to them to dispose of the soil or to tamper with the institutions. Clovis regarded himself as a Roman functionary, and was very proud when he obtained the title of consul from the emperor. 30 years after his death, his successors still accepted the laws promulgated by the emperors, and considered themselves bound to see that they were observed. The beginning of the 7th century must be reached before the barbarian chiefs of Gaul are found to venture on issuing money bearing their own effigy. Until then, their coins had always borne the effigy of the emperors. It is only from this period onwards that it can be said that the Gallic population ceased to regard the emperor as their chief. In fact, the historians make the history of France begin 200 years too soon, and accord us some 10 kings too many. Nothing less resembles a conquest than the barbarian invasions, since the populations retained their lands, their language, and their laws, which is never the case in connection with the true conquests, such as that, for example, of England by the Normans. It is probable that the disappearance of the authority of Rome was so gradual that it took place unperceived by the people of the period. The provinces had been accustomed for centuries to be governed by chiefs acting in the name of the emperors. Very gradually and very slowly their chiefs came to govern on their own account. Nothing in consequence was changed. The same regime continued under new masters throughout the Merovingian period. Footnote: the Merovingian government, declares M. Fustel de Coulanges, was in the main a continuation of that which the Roman Empire had given Gaul. There was nothing feudal about the government of the Merovingians. End of footnote. The only real change, and it ended by becoming a very profound change, was the formation of a new historic race, involving as a necessary consequence, according to the laws we have set forth, the birth of a new civilization. In virtue of that eternal repetition of the same phenomena, which seems the most fixed of the laws of history, we are probably destined to witness in contemporary history pacific invasions analogous to those which brought about the transformation of Roman civilization. In view of the general extension of modern civilization, it may seem that nowadays there are no longer any barbarians, or at any rate that these barbarians, relegated to the depths of Asia and Africa, are too far from us to be very redoubtable. Assuredly we have not to fear being invaded by them, and if they are to be dreaded it will only be, as I have shown in another work, because the time may come when they will enter into economic rivalry with Europe. It is not with them in consequence that we are concerned here, but though the barbarians may seem to be very distant, they are in reality very close, far closer than at the time of the Roman emperors. The fact is that they exist in the very bosom of civilized nations. In consequence of the complication of our modern civilization and of that progressive differentiation of individuals to which I have referred, each people contains an immense number of inferior elements incapable of adapting themselves to a civilization that is too superior for them. There results an enormous waste population, and the peoples who come to be invaded by it will have reason to dread the experience. At the present day it is towards the United States of America that these new barbarians direct their steps with a common accord, and it is by them that the civilization of this great nation is seriously threatened. So long as the foreign immigration was on a small scale and composed in the main of English elements, its absorption was easy and useful. It has brought about the astonishing greatness of America. The United States are now exposed to a gigantic invasion of inferior elements which they neither wish nor are able to assimilate. Between 1880 and 1890 they received nearly 6 millions of emigrants, almost exclusively composed of workmen of a low class and of every nationality. Today, of the 1,100,000 inhabitants of Chicago, not a quarter are Americans. The population includes 400,000 Germans, 220,000 Irish, 50,000 Poles, 55,000 Czechs, etc. There is no fusion between these immigrants and the Americans. They do not even take the trouble to learn the language of their new country, in which they form mere colonies engaged in badly paid occupations. They are discontented and in consequence dangerous. During the recent railway strike, Chicago narrowly escaped being burned down by them, and it was necessary to fire on them pitilessly. It is solely among their ranks that are recruited the adepts of that barbarous and levelling socialism, which is perhaps realizable in decadent Europe, but is quite antipathetic to the character of true Americans. The conflicts which socialism is about to engender on the soil of the great republic will be, in reality, conflicts between races which have reached different levels of evolution. It seems evident that in the civil war that is preparing between the America of the Americans and the America of the foreigners, the triumph will not rest with the barbarians. The gigantic struggle will doubtless end in a hecatomb, reproducing on an immense scale the complete extermination of the Cimbrians of Marius. If the struggle is at all delayed and the invasion continues, it will become impossible that the solution should be total destruction. In that case, the destiny of the United States will probably be that of the Roman Empire, that is to say, the breaking up of the existing provinces of the Republic into independent states, as divided and as frequently at war as those of Europe, or as those of Spanish America. America is not the only country threatened by these invasions. There is one state in Europe, France, which is menaced in the same way. It is a rich country whose population does not increase, surrounded by poor countries whose population is constantly increasing. The immigration of these neighbours is inevitable, and the more so as it is rendered necessary by the growing exigencies of our working classes, taken in connection with the needs of agriculture and industry. The advantages these immigrants find on our soil are evident. They are freed from the obligation of military service. Being foreign nomads, they have few or no taxes to pay, and the work is easier and better paid than in their native territory. Further, they invade our country not merely because of its riches, but because the majority of other countries are always passing laws forbidding their entrance. This invasion of foreigners is the more redoubtable in that it is naturally the most inferior elements, those that cannot succeed in making a livelihood in their own country, that emigrate. Our humanitarian principles condemn us to undergo an ever-increasing foreign invasion. 40 years ago there were only 400,000 such foreign immigrants. Today they number over 1,200,000, and they are always flocking in increasing hordes. Considered merely in respect to the number of Italians it contains, Marseille might be called an Italian colony. Italy does not possess a single colony that contains a like number of Italians. If the present conditions do not change, if, that is to say, these invasions do not stop, but a very short time will have to elapse before a third of the population of France has become German and a third Italian. What can become of the unity or even of the existence of a people under such conditions? The worst disasters on the battlefield would be infinitely less grave than such invasions. These invasions being the consequence of certain economical phenomena it is impossible to control, they cannot be prevented. Still, certain measures might be taken which would at least check them. Obligatory military service in the Foreign Legion for all foreigners less than 25 years of age and counting 2 years' residence. Military tax on the older immigrants. Almost entire suppression of naturalization. Tax amounting to 1/4 of the income or salary on all foreigners established in France for less than 50 years. The deputy who should cause such a law to be voted would be worthy of a statue erected by his grateful country. It was a very sure instinct that taught the ancient peoples to dread foreigners. They were well aware that the situation of a country is judged not by the number of its inhabitants, but by that of its citizens. Once more we find that at the bottom of all historical and social questions lies the inevitable racial problem. It dominates all the others. Section 11.